And I have been asked by the organizers of this event, Professor Jonathan Grobart and Professor Emanuele Saccarelli, to act as moderator. So on their behalf, I welcome you to this webinar. The year 2020 got off to a rather inauspicious start when the United States government announced that it had assassinated the top Iranian general, Qasem Soleimani, and it brought with it the very real possibility of a war with Iran, and a war that would have engulfed the entire world. Now, 10 months down the line, that possibility, while still very real, definitely seems to have been overshadowed by a series of even greater catastrophes. We are now in the thick of a pandemic that has already claimed over 217,000 American lives. The United States, as you know, accounts for approximately 4% of the world's population, but it accounts for nearly 20% of the total COVID cases recorded so far in the world, with the numbers touching nearly 9 million as of now. We are in the midst of an economic crisis, the likes of which has not been seen perhaps since the Great Depression, with staggering numbers of unemployed and millions of Americans facing the stark choice between paying rent and putting food on the table. Since the murder of George Floyd at the end of May in Minneapolis, the entire country has been engulfed in protests against police brutality and racism. And all of this is happening at a time when the entire West Coast of the United States seems to be engulfed by wildfires, fires of a very real sort. In the last month alone, we have heard of plots to kidnap and assassinate political figures by right-wing militias who have targeted people like the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer. With less than a week to go to the presidential elections, it seems very clear that we are at the edge of a precipice. How did we get to this point? What is left of American democracy on the eve of the 2020 presidential elections? The very fact that this webinar has attracted more than 464 registered viewers is a testament to the urgency of the situation. It's a testament to the critical importance of the questions being asked and the dire need of forums of this sort. So on behalf of the organizers, I'd like to thank the Political Science Department for its generosity and support in enabling us to host an event of this sort. But above all, I'd like to thank our panelists for making time to join us today. We are extremely privileged to have with us two of the most eminent public intellectuals of the past few decades, Adolph Reed and David North, to come share their views about the state of American democracy and the path ahead. Adolph Reed is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. He has specialized in African-American political thought and the politics of race and class. His recent publications include Socialism and the Argument Against Race Reductionism and Antiracism, a Neoliberal Alternative to the Left. Welcome. David North is chairman of the editorial board of the World Socialist website and the author of numerous books, including The Crisis of American Democracy, The Russian Revolution and the Unfinished 20th Century, and A Quarter Century of War. Welcome. So we are very honored that you are here with us today, and we very much look forward to hearing what you have to say. So the structure of this webinar is going to be very simple. Our panelists have agreed to keep their introductory statements to between 10 and 15 minutes, after which we will open up the forum to questions from the audience. So the question is, if you'll all notice that there's a Q&A button, and many of you are already using it. So there are already questions coming up on the forum. So please wait until the panelists have given their introductory statement, after which you are welcome to post your questions and we will work our way through them in the time that we have available. So without any further ado, I'd like to invite our panelists to speak. David North has agreed to go first. So here we have David North. Welcome and thank you again.
Allow me to express my appreciation to the Political Science Department of San Diego State and to Jonathan Graubart, Brianna Wiley, Emanuele Zaccarelli, and Latha Varadarajan for organizing and allowing me to participate in this discussion. Let me also state that I am especially pleased to have the opportunity to share this podium with a scholar so distinguished and intellectually principled, politically militant, and as devoted to the cause of the working class as Professor Adolph Reed. I have had the good fortune to deliver a number of lectures at SDSU during the past few years, but it has always been in person and before a visible audience. The meetings, especially the question and answer period, have always been both lively and challenging. I intend to keep my opening remarks fairly brief in order to allow as much time for questions as possible and for an exchange of views. I think that Latha has very well opened up this discussion by pointing to the extraordinary circumstances under which we are meeting. The pandemic is what we have called in the World Socialist website a trigger event. It is, in a sense, as significant an event in history as the outbreak of the First World War. This is an event which, if I can speak directly to the students of SDSU, will profoundly change your lives and will have a profound impact upon the future. And it is an event which will not be resolved only through science or even predominantly through science or medicine, but rather through political action. If anything can be said about the experience of the past year, the ever-rising toll and death, misery, and tragedy, it is that it has completely, totally, and irrevocably exposed the political, social, economic, and I might add moral bankruptcy of the capitalist system. In much the same way as the First World War blew apart the myths and self-confidence of an era which until 1917, capitalism seemed invincible. Millions of people all over the world, and this must be stressed, regardless of their nationality, regardless of their ethnicity, their racial background, their religion, in all parts of the world, the impact of this pandemic is being felt. Latha has already referred to the death toll in America, which is approaching and probably greater than 227,000. Over 1 million people have died throughout the world. In Brazil, the death toll is 157,000. In India, 120,000. In Italy, 57,000. Britain, 46,000. Today, Germany has announced that it is once again entering into a lockdown. Every attempt to control this virus has failed, not because it's beyond the ability of society to organize, if it were properly organized, an effective response, but because all measures to control this virus are frustrated by the needs and interests of the capitalist system. And nowhere is this truer and more bluntly expressed than in the United States. What has been called the most advanced capitalist country in the world is being exposed as the most socially impoverished, culturally bankrupt of all societies. And it's within this context that we are going to discuss the present situation in the United States. And with reference again to the pandemic, when we call it a trigger event, it is intensifying and accelerating all the contradictions that were present even before the pandemic began. Trump did not emerge from hell. He is only the most visible and rotten expression of a very, very advanced political disease in this country. Now, if I wanted to keep my opening remarks really brief, I could answer the question posed in the title of this forum, what is left of American democracy on the eve of the 2020 elections, with just 2 words. Not much. But clearly that is not a sufficient answer. I think Latha and Emanuele expect more of me and Adolph Reed. But though a more expansive explanation is required, the 2-word answer is correct. We are meeting less than a week before the presidential election, and the central question uppermost in the minds of millions of people is not who will win next Tuesday, but whether Election Day will even determine who will occupy the White House come next January 20th. What are the questions that millions of people are asking or thinking about? Will the voting process next Tuesday be accompanied by violence? Will gun-toting fascists intimidate voters opposed to Trump? Will votes cast against Trump, especially those sent by mail, even be counted? Will the Supreme Court, whose majority now consists of vicious reactionaries, block the counting of ballots or rule invalid for one or another fraudulent reason tens of thousands of votes cast against Trump in critical battleground states? Will legislators in states controlled by the Republicans simply ignore the outcome of balloting if Biden receives a majority of the vote, and then proceed to select, as the Supreme Court indicates they can, a slate of electors that will cast their votes for Trump when the Electoral College meets late December? And will Trump, even in the face of a clear determination that he has been defeated at the polls, will he accept the outcome of the election? All the indications are at the present time that he will not. Trump will declare that the vote totals reported by the media are fake news, that the election has been stolen, and that he will remain president. And even if he concludes that he must give up the White House, Trump will remain a substantial political force, appealing to his supporters within police forces throughout the country and right-wing militia groups, declaring that he was stabbed in the back, and continuing to build up an extra-constitutional and paramilitary force upon which he and other elements in his entourage will continue, using violence and terror, his struggle to regain power, or whoever succeeds him in the emergence of a genuinely fascistic movement. There is not the slightest element of exaggeration in the political scenarios that I have outlined. In fact, they are not merely predictions of what may occur. The election campaign, as Latha has indicated, is already dominated by violent conspiracies. Just 2 weeks ago, the FBI exposed a far advanced plot to kidnap and murder the governor of Michigan. A similar plot has been exposed in Virginia. And it is evident that the conspirators are part of a national network of right-wing terrorists. Even more serious than the plot itself has been the response of Trump, the media, and the Democratic Party. Trump, not surprising to anyone, has made clear his political and moral solidarity with the assassins, and all but publicly proclaimed that he wishes them better luck in their next attempt. He has continued to denounce Michigan Governor Whitmer and has made explicit threats of physical violence against other Democratic governors and elected officials. The media has all but buried what is the most chilling event in this election campaign. The plot to murder the governor of Michigan and overthrow the state government, has been treated as a minor event, requiring only cursory coverage. Within 2 days, the story had disappeared from the front pages of the national press, and within less than a week, almost entirely from news reports. As for the Democrats, their response to the plot to murder a leading member of their party has bordered on total indifference. Their expression of political solidarity with Governor Whitmer has been perfunctory. There has been no call by Biden, the Democratic Party leader in the Senate, Charles Schumer, or the Democratic House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, for a full-scale investigation into a terrorist conspiracy against Whitmer and the state government. And the matter was not even raised in the last debate between Biden and Trump. Now, what accounts for the extraordinarily muted response of the Democrats? Why have they not made Trump's fascistic conspiracy to defy the results of the election a central issue? Why have they not issued a warning that the very survival of American democracy is in danger? To answer this question is to get to the heart of this question, the question posed by this meeting. This election campaign exhibits all the characteristics, speaking metaphorically, of a slow motion train wreck of American democracy. Trump and the forces around him are seeking to create the foundations for a political dictatorship of a distinctly fascistic character. There is no other way his actions can be interpreted. Trump speaks for the most ruthless sections of the corporate financial oligarchy, whose political program, in essence, is the removal of all restraints on the exploitation of the working class. And that is why he so openly and brutally declares his indifference to the loss of human life. Nothing must stop the opening of the economy. Nothing must stop the herding of workers into factories, students into schools, teachers into unprotected classrooms, all for the purpose of continuing to produce profit for the coffers of the financial elite. As for the Democratic Party, I think one could almost call them the let's pretend party, a party that pretends to be an opposition, that pretends to be a popular party, but in fact a party which is no less tied to the ruling oligarchy than the Republicans themselves. And their particular function in the division of labor that constitutes American capitalist politics is to exert all their influence to prevent the development of any popular movement of protest that comes to threaten the essential financial interests of those who rule this country. And their concern, above all, is not Trump's threats against democracy, not the danger of dictatorship. Their concern is that the resistance to such efforts could acquire the character of a mass movement that threatens the financial and, one might add, global military interests of American capitalism and American imperialism. And that, in essence, is the nature of the situation. But what lies behind it? No discussion of political reality in America is worth anything if it does not call attention to the staggering levels of social inequality. Marx was right. The history of mankind is the history of class struggle. In the modern era, it's the history of the struggle between the capitalist class and the working class. Now, if there's any election which bears comparison to the present situation in the United States, it's the election of 1860. It was an election in which a substantial section of the country, dominated by the slave owners, would not accept the outcome of an election which put a president opposed to slavery in the White House. And when that election went against their interests, they went into insurrection, and the Civil War came. The irrepressible conflict had finally erupted into open warfare. Before the election, Lincoln had said famously, the United States can't exist half slave and half free. Well, democracy can't exist in a country where virtually all the wealth is dominated by the richest 0.11% or 5% of the population, where there is a relatively affluent 10%, while the remaining 90% are in various levels of economic distress and outright poverty. This is the situation which is undermining American democracy and, in fact, democracy throughout the world. Oligarchies rule in every country. In America, it is only the most egregious and most naked, but the same situation exists throughout the world. This is the issue which underlies the crisis here, and this is why there is no way out of the crisis and no way in which democracy can be defended unless it's reconstituted on an entirely different basis, on the basis of socialism, on the basis of the transfer of power to the working class, to the vast majority of the population. And this is not just an American question, it is a global question. It's not a question which concerns a race, that great diversion from real issues. It concerns the fate of the vast majority of the world, which consists of working people, the working class. So I think when we speak, if I could conclude, and when we speak of the fate of American democracy or democratic rights anywhere in the world, we must recognize that we have come into a period where the great issue is, if there is to be democracy, it is only possible on the basis of social equality, on the basis of ending the capitalist system. And I think I'm speaking now both as the editor of the World Socialist website, but also as the chairman of the Socialist Equality Party in the United States. I hope that those of you who are listening think very carefully about the situation which you confront as students, as young people, as workers, and come to the conclusion that a fundamental and profound change is needed in society, one which unites all sections of the working class. And with that, I'd like to turn the podium over to Professor Reid.
Hi, Dave. Thank you very much. And I want to chime in to thank everyone who was responsible for organizing the event and for inviting me and us. I think we're going to have a very stimulating discussion. And we're going to, I think our presentation is a sort of tag team, right? Because when I have thought about the best way or a useful way into this discussion tonight, and I'm also going to try to be brief, which I know can be one of the deadliest things an academic can ever say, but I think I'll start out with a provocation, right? That what the current moment may throw into relief, or what actually may help us to make sense of the current moment, is to consider that neoliberalism, which has been the reigning ideology and institutional program of capitalism in the West and in most of the rest of the world, at least since Reagan. I sometimes date it from the Carter administration, since Carter was ultimately a warm-up act for Reagan. But from some perspectives, you can even think of the zygote of neoliberalism as being formed in the Kennedy administration, at the moment when commitment to currency currency stability in the national government in the U.S. completely pushed commitment to full employment off the agenda. But my comrade and colleague Mark Dudzik and I have proposed a sort of pithy understanding of what neoliberalism is, and we've described it as capitalism that's effectively eliminated working class opposition. So it's like an institutional and ideological and organizational framework for class struggle with only one class struggling, basically. So from that perspective, that's not the provocation. I mean, that's just that's just setting ground rules. But the provocation is that when we look not just at the U.S. since the Great Crash, but also what's been happening in the defeat of the pink tide regimes in Latin America, Greece, Hungary, Poland, India, Turkey, we may have, and the rise of right-wing authoritarian parties flying under the false flag of populism in much of the world, that we may be coming onto a circumstance at which neoliberalism is exhausting its capacities for delivering enough to enough of the population to maintain legitimacy as a nominally democratic order, right? And part of what Trumpism represents could be a reaction, and it's complex because there are complex political forces that have come together to produce this outcome, and I think it'd be helpful for us to talk about those too. And I mean, in particular, what's often called right-wing populism or working class populism or whatever. But if the system is no longer capable of persuasively appealing to the loyalties of the broad masses of the society via democratic institutions, then there are probably only two ways forward, two alternatives for ways forward. One is Trumpism or the right-wing authoritarianism, or authoritarian populism as they call it now. It's really authoritarian neoliberalism. And the other being steps in the direction of seriously social democratic intervention and reform. And I'd like to pick up on one of the points that Dave made about the Democrats. It was clear in the 2020 primary race that the mainstream of the Democratic Party was much more concerned about a victory of the left than it was about the possibility of a second Trump administration. Now, considering that, as my dad often said, one way to think about what ideology is that it's a mechanism that harmonizes the principles that you like to believe you hold with what advances your interests. So from that perspective, I'm certain that Pelosi and Schumer and the rest convinced themselves that wasn't the trade-off that they were making, that they convinced themselves that the same non-program and dismissal of the felt concerns of working class voters that cost them the 2016 election was in fact the best way to win again. It cost them 2016, it cost them 2000, cost them 2004, cost them 1988, cost them 1984, cost them 1980. But the long and short of it is that that Sanders, the Sanders campaign in both 2016 and in 2020 had actually begun to address concerns that working people, that the broadly understood working class was concerned about. And one of a key takeaway from the 2020 primary season was that in more than 20 consecutive primaries, even those like South Carolina, where Sanders lost badly to Biden, a majority of Democratic voters indicated in exit polls that they were committed to Medicare for all. And in fact, we were working in South Carolina around that time, and actually had found more than 18,000 South Carolinians, mainly Black, mainly working class, signed pledges indicating that they would prefer to vote for candidates. They prefer to vote only for candidates who supported Medicare for all. Before the pandemic hit and changed the nature of the conversation, along with the George Floyd murder, that there was a national base of popular support for Medicare for all, which we found in our work, and others did too, that once people started to talk among themselves and on their own about healthcare as a public good and a right, the conversation naturally bled or flowed over to other essential areas of life that ought to be decommodified, like K through PhD education and even housing, right? And one of the concerns then, or rather, well, yeah, I'll just say it. One of the concerns that I've had about the shift in focus to a race reductionist understanding of inequality, which of course had been gaining steam for a decade or so anyway, is that the model of social justice on which the idea that disparities are the most egregious or even sole actionable types of inequality is that that the normative foundation of the insistence that disparities are the worst kinds of inequalities is simply capitalist equality of opportunity, but with discrimination taken away. And to be clear, I don't condone discrimination. I would be psychotic if I did, and agree that we need to fight against it relentlessly. But it's also true that if parity is our only norm of justice, then it's easy to imagine that we can have a society in which 1% of the population controls 90% of the stuff, and that would be considered a just society, so long as 12% of the 1% were Black, it were half female, 14% Hispanic, and whatever the appropriate percentages of gays and lesbians and transgender people would be. And the problem with that, of course, as a norm of justice, is that in a sharply unequal society, and one that's a trajectory is to become more and more unequal in the aggregate. You can wind up with a society that meets the norm of parity, or roughly speaking, while significant majorities of Black, Brown, and Black and Brown people and women and others would be at the bottom still, and holding the undesirable end of the stick. And one of the things that's happened over the course of the pandemic is that democratic elites, the foundation world, the corporate media have been working overtime to make economic inequality disappear, right? And to sweep away the earlier discussion of policies like Medicare for all. So that's one. So one thing I would say about where we are on the eve of the election, and this may be one of the most important things to say about it, is that we're going to have the same problems no matter whether Biden wins or Trump wins, that we had before the pandemic and that we've had through the pandemic. Obviously, we need to do whatever can be done to try to support or to try to bring about a Biden victory. But the reality is that we're going to have the same problems that we would have had, and they're the problems of the maturing contradictions of neoliberal capitalism. And I think the only way forward for us is to commit to trying to build a broad-based working class movement to fight for an agenda that speaks to the actual needs of the actual working people. I vowed, also that I wasn't going to go more than 10 or 12 minutes, and I think I'm there now. And I think I might have. I think we both may have tossed out enough food for thought or raw meat. They got the conversation going now. So with that, I think I'll stop.
Thank you very much, David North, Adolph Reed. If you were in a bigger room, you would hear the applause of over 412 people for a very stimulating introduction. And Thank you. I think it should be evident to our audience the points where our speakers have similar views and where they diverge. And I hope during the course of our question and answer session, we'll have an opportunity to explore both. I'd like to start off the Q&A session by inviting our two organizers to ask their questions. So Professor Jonathan Grobart, would you like to start the Q&A session?
Yes, I would. Thank you very much, Professor Latavadarajan. I'm thrilled we have over 400 people here for this very important and unusual forum. I should say that I've admired Professor Reid's work for now about 4 decades, since I first got exposed to him in the late 1980s. While I'm not an orthodox Marxist, as Professor Varadarajan and Professor Saccarelli know, I do think it's of vital importance, particularly for our students, but really for the public, to really immerse themselves in the Marxist analysis. It certainly seems that that's one thing that's badly lacking in our education. So I think it's a really valuable opportunity to have Mr. North here. So my question, I get to talk a little bit more because I'm one of the 2 organizers, is thinking about how to approach the elections. Certainly, this is a crucial event. Well, I mean, at least a lot of people think this is a crucial event, but as both of you, I think, point out correctly, that what we faced in this country and the world is really dire, and it's not going to be resolved even if Joe Biden wins. So there's really serious situations. I think it's really important that both of you have brought this up. But for those of us who identify with the left, somehow we constantly face the situation is, what do we do in presidential elections when we know the choices are really unpleasant, that the Democrats just has so many problems, the Democratic Party is profoundly flawed. It's hard just not to take note of the elections at all. And so a recurring theme is whether or not to kind of hold our nose and vote for the Democrat. And I think you two sharply disagree on this. So I want to bring up one type of debate. I happened to see this recently. It was a debate between Brianna Joy Gray, who kind of worked on the Bernie Sanders campaign, and Noam Chomsky on whether or not to vote for Biden in the election. The debates didn't get too far. They more or less said the same thing over and over again and just got increasingly annoyed at each other. But I'll just summarize it briefly. Brianna Joy Gray took the position that before those on the left commit themselves to announcing their support for Biden, he needs to make very clear that he's going to adjust his policy somehow, which from her perspective was adopt substantially more of the Bernie Sanders platform. And she said, if we don't do this, then the Democratic Party just keeps taking the left for granted. And so we continue to get nowhere. Chomsky's response was, you're kidding yourself. You have no leverage here. There's nothing you can do that's going to change Biden or the Democratic Party. Those big changes you want, and he would probably want bigger changes than Brianna Joy Gray, that's going to have to be through politics, much more generally understood. So mass mobilization, mass education, it's not going to come from the presidential election. So, with that kind of as a setup, what's kind of would you like to just kind of state your view on how does one approach the presidential elections? Does one hold one's nose and know that the real political activism is elsewhere? I certainly think Professor Reid has one perspective, and for Mr. North, presumably one of Mr. North's advice is to, for the vote, just vote for the write-in candidate of the Socialist Equality Party. But isn't that kind of a relatively empty gesture? Okay, so I'll leave it at that.
It's far from being an empty gesture. It is the most politically conscious act you can take. I just want to report in relationship to that here in Michigan, largely through the efforts of the Democratic Party, voters will not even be allowed to write in our candidate, Joseph Kishore, for president of the United States. The Democratic Party has also blocked us from appearing on the ballot in a number of other states on the most anti-democratic grounds. This is the fundamental question of, and there is such a vast amount of experience in relationship to the issue of how one reacts to such elections. Does one, as you say, hold one nose? And all of historical experience and political principle has demonstrated that nothing is more destructive to the development of the class consciousness of the working class, its understanding of the nature of society, than to tell workers in an election that they should cast their vote for the so-called lesser evil, the bourgeois party. It's interesting that this question has come up. I appreciate Professor Glauber raising it, because today we have an editorial in the New York Times entitled "Why Socialists Should Vote for Biden." What one gets again are all the traditional arguments which are fundamentally directed against the fight to establish the political independence of the working class. And in the end, we are given the advice which says socialists should fight like hell to get Mr. Biden into office and then fight like hell the day he becomes president. That, of course, is a complete and fraudulent argument. How can you fight like hell to put in a capitalist politician, tell workers to vote for them, regardless of what their program is, and then say you should fight like hell once he's in office? Because, of course, then the argument will be, well, we have to make sure that the right doesn't come back in, because if Biden goes, then we'll have the fascists. Now, I could go into long experience about the Popular Front, the long experience of how the subordination of working class parties to bourgeois parties has always proved catastrophic. But we can go into, briefly, American history. First of all, why isn't there a socialist movement in the United States? The basic problem in this, the most powerful capitalist country, has always been the problem of establishing the political independence of the working class from the parties of the bourgeoisie. And again, over decades, every 4 years, the question of subordinating the working class to the two-party system has had catastrophic results. Way back when, in 1964, of course, it's almost a cliche. People were told they had to vote for Johnson against Goldwater to prevent war, and sure enough, we got Vietnam. And even more recently, and earlier today, or actually yesterday, Adolph Reed and I had a discussion, and he made the point, which I thoroughly agree with, that you can't even begin to understand how we have Trump without recalling the disastrous experience of Obama, who came into office promising change you can believe in, and then proceeded to carry out policies which continued war without stop, which bailed out the ruling class, which presided over a massive impoverization of the workers here in Detroit, where they came to an agreement which cut the wages of auto workers in half. And if we look at the record, and I'll conclude my remarks just with this, if we look at the record of the Democratic Party during the past 4 years, what has their opposition to Trump really consisted of? It's really been centered on one question, the question of foreign policy. To the extent that the Democratic Party has a difference with Trump, it's that they believe that he has been insufficiently vigorous in the prosecution of the interests of American imperialism against Russia and against China. Their continuous argument has been that Trump is a Russian agent. That's what they organized their so-called impeachment campaign on. They wanted, in effect, a palace coup, but they've been absolutely silent on the real political crimes that Trump has committed. They're not interested in any action which in any way would threaten their financial interests. So we say that if one looks at the political situation today, one has to be focused on what is to come. You can't initiate a fight against Trump today by supporting Biden. Remember, when you vote, you take responsibility in your own way for the consequences of that vote. And so what now must be prepared, if one accepts the seriousness of the situation, you have to ask, what are the real demands? What will the nature of the fight against the growth of the extreme right be in the next period? You have to fight for an independent political program of the working class. You have to turn to the workers and educate them on the need to break with the Democratic Party. You have to put before them a program which can also lead workers who are confused by Trump to understand where their class interests lie. Many workers voted for Obama in 2008 because they believed that Obama, coming from the African American community, would be more sympathetic to the conditions of the poor. They were totally betrayed. And that is what opened up the door for Trump's demagogy. So what has to be put forward is a very class-conscious line. The most far-sighted political action you can take is to break with the politics of lesser evilism, the politics of subordinating the working class to the bourgeois parties, cast a write-in vote for Joe Kishore and as our presidential candidate, and Narissa Diaz as our vice presidential candidate. That is the most important action you can take. And from there, join the Revolutionary Party, the Socialist Equality Party, and really build a genuine working class revolutionary internationalist alternative to both capitalist parties.
Thank you, David North. Professor Reid, would you like to address this question? Because I think your answer might be somewhat different.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, it's funny because Dave and I are like riding along together for about 80 to 85% of the way, but somehow like our destinations are a little different, or punchlines are a little different. I mean, I agree about lesser evilism. I mean, I spent more than 15 years around the clock trying to build an independent political party in the labor movement, and had the frustrations of trying to move the working class institutions, right, notch to in our direction. But I mean, I've often said that that I think leftists in the U.S. make too much of the electoral realm, right? And I've taken to saying in the last few years that we need to treat our votes promiscuously, like it's not our chastity, right? And we do it, and I think we should think about casting our votes in much more instrumental ways. I mean, Dave probably wouldn't take to this comparison either, but to me, 2020, and to be clear, like I counted up, and I think I've voted for Democrats for about half of the elections. Half the presidential elections I've been eligible to vote in. Just as often I voted for a third-party candidate or didn't vote at all. So I'm not one of those people. But in 2016, I urged that is offensive in most ways that she was, that the responsible thing to do is to vote for Hillary Clinton, and I'll make the same argument now. And in both cases, and this is the analogy I figured that Dave wouldn't like either, but in both cases, for me, the vote has all of the moral force of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Treaty, right? It's an instrumental act to try to create a little bit of space to try to arm ourselves for the war we know is coming, and Dave's initial comment, right, which I also very much agree with respect to what's left of the Democrats, is absolutely correct. Not much. So the question then is, how do we start finally trying to build an organically rooted left, or a left that's organically rooted in the working class? And that's what the challenge needs to be. And I don't think we're going to do that through floating electoral candidacies. But what we can do is, and like, I don't have any problem saying to people, yeah, we need to elect Biden, but we need to elect Biden in the same way you need to take castor oil or to lance a wound, right? I mean, a slogan I came up with for the Biden-Harris campaign is Biden-Harris 2020, because sometimes you just have to clean the damn toilet, right? And that's what it's like. So I think it's just something we have to do to create space for us to try to organize, because the other part of the lesson of 2020 and the period between 2016 and 2020 is how disorganized and demobilized the working class is, and the Democrats are largely responsible for that. And with respect to the Obama Trump connection, I'll take it a step further, that Obama presented himself as the solution to working people's problems and anxieties because of his race. Trump has presented himself as the solution to working people's problems and anxieties because of his race, right? If you sow the wind, then you reap the whirlwind. And the Democrats still are committed in some ways to this fantasy that a coalition built on an upper middle class suburban white women and racial or ethnic brokerage politics and Wall Street is going to put them in the White House. I'm not convinced it's going to happen, but I think we all now, if we're serious, well, I'm going to say that, but we all now, from an organizing perspective, need to hope that a Biden-Harris administration can take power and stop some of the bleeding, right? I mean, there'll be no more labor rights with another Trump administration. There'll be no OSHA. There'll be no environmental protection, right? There'll be nothing that even hints at reproductive freedom, right? And authoritarian government will be on the rise. And look, I mean, it's in my frustrated and cynical moments, right? I guess it's a reflection partly of my own marginal identification as an American, but watching these moves that the Trumpists are trying to make toward toward the new device or technique of constitutional coup perpetrated by the judiciary that we've seen already in Brazil and Bolivia, but we have an attempt elsewhere. My first thought is, well, so what? It's not good enough for Americans, but you've done it to everybody else in the damn world. So like chickens will come home to roost. But my point is that another Trump administration could be the end of everything that working people have fought for the last 100 years. And I've never touted Trump Biden as a person to be enthusiastic about. I have no truck for the fantasies that maybe he will rise to the occasion and become FDR, just like and people said the same thing about Obama, by the way. No, they're clearly Wall Street candidates. Biden ran the whole time, right, from the moment that he entered the race, boasting on how he can appeal to Republicans, right? So there's no room for deception there, or self-deception. That said, I think we're in a world of hurt if Biden and Harris don't win, and that's the reason that I think that the responsible thing to do is to vote for them. But you don't have to tout them. So yeah, I guess that's where we differ. But
if I could reply to the points made by.
Sure, as long as you keep it really short, because there are 28 questions already.
I just want to again stress that politics is not based on hope. It's based on a scientific evaluation of the nature of society. And hope very easily degenerates into illusions, and illusions become delusional. A Biden administration will be determined by the interests of American imperialism, just as the response of the Democratic Party to Trump has reflected the interests of a faction of the ruling class. All the danger, and there is something to be learned from history. Parties which have presented themselves far more radical than the Democratic Party, which have evaded the question of the necessity of socialist policy, have ended in catastrophe. Look at Podemos in Spain, Syriza in Greece, the experience of Corbynism in England. Each of these instruments of subordinating the working class to bourgeois politics has ended in disaster. And I think that Americans are being forced by the weight of crisis to come to grips with the bankruptcy, essentially, of a pragmatic approach to political problems. Great historical questions, great political problems do not have easy solutions. They just don't. It's necessary to understand the foundations and real causes of the present crisis, of which Trump is just a symptom, and not the last one. And let's just not forget, what was the experience of Bernie Sanders? What was the fate of his so-called political revolution?
Wait a second. Now, I want to say something about the Sanders thing too.
Let me just finish this. Adolf, and
I'll be very brief with this.
He betrayed, he deluded his.
Sanders, that's bullshit, frankly. Sanders, the whole point of the Sanders effort was, and it was like a gambit that I didn't have a lot of confidence in, but I was kind of persuaded that since there is no movement, there's no basis for a movement, that there was no room in the society for people even to talk about a working class program in public. Sanders used the vehicle of a presidential campaign to help create a discursive context in which it was possible for people actually organizing for the first time in my adult life to be able to talk about a substantively socialist program in, to rank and file ordinary working people. And I never thought, and I mean, nobody else that I worked with ever thought that Bernie had a ghost of a chance to win the nomination. The mainstream Dems made that very clear. But what he did do was provide space in communities around the country for us to organize. I mean, we've been working in South Carolina around Medicare for All for close to a year now. And that would not have been thinkable if the Sanders campaign hadn't gotten people talking about it. So, I mean, to me, Sanders, as I said, was never going to be elected president. He was never going to win the nomination. But if you looked at his effort as a boost to kickstarting like an organizing drive, then I think it was very successful. And I say this too about history. We got to keep in mind that the most important facet of history is its specificity. And the moment that we're in now is a unique moment, like they all are. All right, I'm done. Sorry.
No, that's great. I think it's very important that both of you brought up the candidacy of Bernie Sanders, because I think it is one of the points where your divergence and the different political path comes out very, very clearly. And for our audience in particular, this is very instructive. And so I think maybe we can start talking about some of the many questions that have come up here. Professor Saccarelli, the other organizer, will save his question for the final question, just so that we get some of the audience question here as well. So there have been several questions on the Black Lives Matter movement, and I just wanted to perhaps put them together before. All right. Oh, I guess, I'm sorry. I think I actually, Professor Saccarelli is ready with his question right now. So let me invite him to ask his question before I move on to the audience question. Professor Saccarelli.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. It was just that it seemed like an opportune time to ask the question because, first of all, I think the discussion has immediately settled on the most important groove, that is the issue of the Democratic Party and how should young people and working people understand it. To me, that is the question of questions in American politics. And I wanted to try to approach it just slightly differently, particularly as inspired by the repeated references to history, which I think is for young people. I imagine students in my classes, they're coming into political life, understanding the stakes, and I think they can read the tea leaves of just the seriousness of the crisis and where this might be going. But it's as if because of the character of American political culture and American political life, due to no fault of their own, there's a certain recurring amnesia where every generation enters into politics, looks at what's on the left, what's on the right, and sort of makes more or less pragmatic choice to kind of try this out. Mm-hmm. And to me, so what I wanted to ask was a more kind of panoramic appraisal of what the Democratic Party is. I mean, I understand what Professor Reid said about the specificity, but is there a generalization that can be made surveying the 2 centuries of history of this party that would hold and that would have profound implications for young people in particular trying to orient themselves in the political situation today? What is the Democratic Party? I can understand that we can pick apart different sort of bits and pieces of it, this candidate or that candidate, but in a historical sense, what is the Democratic Party and what does it represent?
Well, I mean, I think the Democratic Party was one thing from 1828 to 1932, right? It was a different thing from 1932 to 1980 or 76 or 92, depending on where you want to draw the lines. It's been something else that's pretty coherent since 1992 at least. Pardon me. And what that is like the party of technocratic neoliberalism, basically. And it's interesting that the Republicans, and it's interesting to contrast 1964 for the Republicans and 1972 for the Democrats. 1964, Goldwater lost ignominiously, and the right-wing alliance that he floated on the top of, or was the hood ornament for, figured out that they made their political move too soon and were too exuberant, and then spent the next 16 years actually trying to organize, right? And yeah, I mean, they were well funded with a big right-wing money, but they spent years in California, not too far from San Diego, for instance, but I mean, other places around the country as well, field testing messages, right? That would help them fashion an electoral coalition that put together a mass base around a set of agendas that had nothing all to do with a political economy, except treating opposition to taxation as a beatitude, and a class base, right, of the bourgeoisie, right? And it's been possible for them to sort of feed, the popular base, so-called moral issues, right? And to deliver the ruling class base a radical or a program of radical radical upward transfer and redistribution. The Democrats, since Roosevelt, have had a popular electoral base that's connected to economic concerns and aspirations, but they've had that the same that they've been vying with the GOP for that same bourgeois base, right? So the contradictions for the Democrats have been tougher to manage, and there are ways that they've finessed it, right? Like crafting race as an issue in the ways that they've crafted race as an issue, right, over the last 25 to 30 years, from a deprecation of a largely black and brown a so-called urban underclass on the one side, and in support for programs that at least symbolically address widening avenues of upward mobility for black and brown PMC. So in that sense, I mean, the Democratic Party, and I think that Dave and I agree on this, what the Democratic Party is not the party of the working class. It's never going to be the party of the working class. And it hasn't ever really been the party of the working class. It's often been, at some points in its history, it was a less worse alternative to a working class party. But I've spent the last 25 to 30 years waiting for or hoping for the Democratic Party to have the moment when it melts down like the Whigs in the 1850s, where it collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. This would not be the time for that to happen, obviously.
Thank you.
I think it would be the ideal time for this to happen. I mean, if we're going to speak about a political party, every political party has represents a definite social and class interest. The Democratic Party, of course, historically, is the oldest capitalist party in the United States. It was, for a long period, the party of the slave owners, the party of the most reactionary sections of the bourgeoisie. In the South, it was the party until the 1960s of Jim Crow. It was based on an alliance of the sections of the northern bourgeoisie with the southern, most reactionary southern forces. It was never a party of the working class. It was a party, however, which acquired, to the extent that it had an urban base, and that was partly bound up with the fact that the Republican Party had emerged as the party after the Civil War of the rising capitalist class. Its specific task was to keep the working class from developing an independent political orientation. That became more and more the political skill associated with the Democratic Party, whether it was through Bryan in the 1890s, who deflected the emergence of the People's Party back into capitalist politics. Later on, through, of course, Roosevelt, who was quite clear. His aim was to utilize the vast resources, which were still substantial, of American capitalism to present a limited reformist program to prevent the emergence of a socialist and communist movement in the United States. It was then, of course, under Roosevelt that the United States was taken into the Second World War. It was under Truman that 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Japan. And the Democratic Party is a party which, during its heyday, its halcyon era of liberalism, sought to combine a program of very limited social reform with fealty to the interests of American imperialism. And if we look at it's been often said that the Democratic Party is the graveyard of all progressive movements. Every time there emerges a movement of social opposition, the Democratic Party puts forward a pseudo-left face, only to corral and to basically castrate a movement and make sure that no independent class movement emerges. And I have to strongly disagree with Adolph on this point. This has been the role in the most naked way, not only of Obama, but more recently of Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders' specific, his political revolution degenerated into the most obsequious subordination of the working class to the Democratic Party, a Democratic Party today which is completely dominated by Wall Street. It is the recipient of huge resources from the corporate elite, and a substantial portion of its personnel is directly recruited from the intelligence agencies. We wrote a lengthy series, my colleague Patrick Martin of the World Socialist website wrote a devastating analysis, which he entitled The CIA Democrats, in which he showed that a large portion of candidates of the Democratic Party are recruited directly from the intelligence agencies. And their opposition to Trump throughout the last 4 years has been dominated entirely by objections to his foreign policy. They've developed this entire absurd Russia narrative, which Trump has actually exploited in his own interests, because they claim that all the problems of the United States are the result of manipulation by the Russians. This is absurd, and this is tied up with, in a sense, their foreign policy agenda. I mean, they have been astonishingly aggressive on questions related to the Middle East. They want intervention in Syria. They want intervention in Libya. I mean, all of these took place under Obama. And what is to come?
I agree with you about all of that. What the issue comes down to is, what about Trump's second term?
Well, I mean, Trump's second term will be, of course, should you be in office, it will see mounting efforts to establish a fascistic dictatorship.
Right.
And everything depends, for that very reason, on establishing the political independence of the working class. Look, one thing which said,
Trump in the second term, man. I mean, this is the part I don't understand. Right?
This is the lesson of the 1930s and of popular frontism. And in every case where the working class was subordinated to the bourgeois parties, whether you want to talk about the tragedy of the Spanish Revolution, if you want to talk about the tragedy of Chile, if you want to talk about every major political tragedy which has taken place, has involved the subordination of the working class struggle to so-called progressive sections of the bourgeoisie.
But the working class struggles in the working class struggles that you just mentioned, every one of them, there actually wasn't organized revolutionary working class. There is not one in.
No, I disagree with you. I mean, look, rather than blaming the working class, we founded the World Socialist website to educate the working class. I mean, everyone wants to blame the workers for what they haven't done, but why not look at the responsibility of leaders? I mean, what effort has been made?
Now, I'm talking about functioning.
You're very experienced with left politics.
I think
those who give a false political orientation to the working class, who don't fight to raise the political level, which is the basic responsibility of socialists. We're responsible for what we say. We're responsible for what we do. We're
responsible for connecting with real working people through.
We put out the World Socialist website.
Yeah. I mean, let's go to the audience, right? Because
there is an audience for genuine socialism.
No. The reason I think this is wonderful and lively, and thank you to both of you for. I wanted to stop you right here, partly because one of the audience questions actually directly feeds into this discussion that you are having, and it's directed at both of you. And it says, Professor Reid argues that a vote for Biden will create room for the left to organize. Can Professor Reid explain what organizing means to him? If David North agrees that the left needs to organize, how would his vision differ or align with Professor Reid's vision? I think the way in which you were both talking right now is already beginning to answer our audience members' question about what does it mean to have the space to organize the working class in a certain way. And so if I could invite you both to just talk a little bit more based on your own experiences in revolutionary politics.
Right, well, sure. I mean, what I mean, I'll go at it this way. Jane McAlevy's a long time trade union organizer and housing organizer, and also now a sociologist. In a very important book called No Shortcuts, makes a clear distinction between what she refers to as mobilizing and organizing. And the vast majority of what people on the left do now, even when they think that they are organizing, they're in fact engaging in moralizing. Like you don't, because mobilizing is fundamentally reaching out to people who already agree with you and moving them to do something. And so like all the practices that exuberant people think of as organizing that involve placards and bullhorns are in fact mobilizing. And what the organizing project hinges on digging deep into institutions and communities and establishing relationships of standing with people who don't already agree with you, right? To try to broaden the base, right? And that's what we haven't done. I mean, that's what we haven't done in this country as a left for 30 years, if not longer. Well, longer, I would say, right? Because, and it's partly what I alluded to in that distinction between the Goldwaterites and the McGovernites, because the Goldwaterites had some place that they were trying to go. And they realized that they'd moved too quickly, and you couldn't do it without creating a constituency for the kind of politics that you want. Where I mean, the McGovernites just assumed that, well, you know, the base was out there because any decent and a reasonable person would believe what we believe. I was actually at a meeting, a Sanders campaign meeting, actually, in Georgetown, South Carolina, last year around this time, at a steelworkers hall, and there were two resistant white members there. One worked in the steel mill, one worked in a paper mill. The guy in the steel mill, what was a moron, right? He was just an old guy, like he said he was a farmer, and the only two things that came out of his mouth, like he was a character from Animal Farm, were bring back manufacturing jobs, kick out the illegal aliens, right? But the other guy was younger, 40-ish, and he said that he liked a lot of what he saw in Sanders' economic program, but what he couldn't understand about the Democrats generally was why they keep permitting themselves to get sidetracked on what he called the moral issues. So I talked to him a little bit, tried to tease it out, and it turns out, he meant same-sex marriage and abortion rights and whatnot. So I tried to talk to him about this, right, and to find some spot of common ground. Like it wasn't simple pluralism, right? But I got someplace with the sayings, and well, look, which is more important to you, right? That no woman should ever be able to have an abortion, or that you will have a right to health care, right? Or that no two gay people could ever marry, or that you have a guaranteed decent pension. And it stopped him in his tracks just for a minute. I wasn't persuasive enough to change his mind, but if there was someone in his immediate world who had standing in his world of associates, he could presumably be won to that kind of understanding. And this speaks to another problem that connects, with the mobilizing approach, which is that too many people who identify with the left treat it like belonging to a frat or a sorority, right? You've got to show that you're good enough to be one of us. And that's exactly the opposite of the organizing approach, because we're trying to find ways to establish common ground with workers, with the confidence that once we are able to present our program for transformation to them, in ways that make sense in the terms that they operate in, right in their own lives, then we're on the way to building a movement.
All right. Thank David North. What does it mean to organize the working class?
Well, we have a great deal of experience in that, since we really are the only movement that is actually active in the working class and is fighting to establish rank and file committees and to create an independent political movement of workers opposed to the bureaucracies, which are totally corporatist, totally controlled by the state, subordinated to the Democratic Party. But if you ask the question, what does it take to build a movement in the working class? Above all, it is a fight to bring socialist consciousness into the working class, to educate, to reach, first of all, the most advanced sections of workers, students and youth, and to educate the working class on the basis of the great historical problems which are involved in the struggle for socialism, to explain to them the nature of the organization of society, to understand the nature of class society, to understand through that the futility of all efforts to reform society without changing the nature of social ownership. You have to explain the nature of the capitalist system. You have to explain the nature of global imperialism. And it really, all these discussions, and when I listen to Adolf speak, and I don't doubt his sincerity, but what is completely missing is any frank discussion of the political and social and economic changes which are now absolutely essential. We're facing, as we discussed at the beginning, a social catastrophe. The question, the pandemic is the form in which this monumental historical crisis of the global economic system has exploded. How is any fundamental change possible without expropriating the wealth of the richest 5% of the population, without placing the corporations under public control, without dismantling the massive military structure which rules this society, without putting an end to the CIA and its far-flung operations? I mean, how is anything possible without tackling these questions?
I don't disagree with any of that. The only question is, how do we get there?
Well, you get there by educating and winning the working class to revolutionary policies, not by telling them that they should vote for one of the leading representatives of American imperialism, whose name is Joseph Biden.
Oh, that's a cheap shot. It really is.
No, but no, it's not.
Well,
It's,
okay,
No, it absolutely is.
it's not a cheap shot. It happens to be very, very honest.
I think
Because the politics.
Well, in the first place, you don't know what our organizing model is.
I see it in Bernie Sanders.
You don't know how it works.
What assessment?
We've done training thousands of workers
What is the outcome of
around
two
corporate
Sanders
power.
campaigns? How have the two Sanders campaigns in any way advanced the cause for the political independence of the working class? How? Look, yesterday when we were discussing, as you pointed out, and you were quite correct when you said to me that many workers who voted for Trump would have voted for Sanders, and they felt deceived and betrayed when he capitulated, supported.
No, I don't go that far.
And that's what happened, because it allowed. And let me pose one other question, one other issue.
Mm-hmm.
The real danger is, and the real danger to the development of the extreme right, is that it is able to exploit the frustration and present itself as the opposition under conditions in which what you refer to as the left is the party of the establishment.
Right.
The fact is that you cannot deal with the danger of dictatorship, fascism, without establishing the independence of the working class. And one final point, which I think is the most fundamental, when we're talking about realistic politics, it's not one which can be based on pragmatic calculations of what's just happening here in America, but what's happening in the world. The struggle of the working class is global in scope. The American working class must have a strategy in which it unites its struggles with the struggles of the working class internationally. And it must fully identify with those struggles. Therefore, it has to oppose every form of imperialism. It has to oppose every form of racial division, because the struggle to unify the working class is a global question. And so these are the issues.
I think
And that is
complete agreement
this is
about
what the
the
World
goals.
Socialist
The
website
question is,
is dedicated.
how do we get there? And how do we possibly get there if there's a second Trump administration with that complete control of
Right.
of the course? I mean,
I think it's very clear, Professor Reid and Mr. Dave North, that there are lots of similarities on the surface, but there are like fundamental differences. And part of why we wanted to have the two of you here is to not just talk about the similarities. So I really appreciate both your honesty and the sincerity with which you have approached it and expressed these differences to our audiences as well. We have so many questions, and actually we are running short of time. So what I would like to do is perhaps present to you a block of questions, and maybe you could divide it up amongst yourselves and answer. There are a lot of questions from our audience about one, the relationship between race and class as it has played out in the United States in the past few months. There are questions about the nature of the Black Lives Movement and whether it is possible for some kind of a vanguard Black Socialist Party to emerge through that. I see you already shaking your head, Professor Reid, so I guess that's not even a question. There's also a question about what both of you think about the attempt to reimagine American history through the 1619 project that the New York Times has tried to push and modify. So that is one question. There's also some serious concerns from our audience members about the existential threat posed by the climate crisis and what you think is the path ahead, given all these challenges that we face in terms of the democratic process. And so I would like you perhaps maybe talk a little bit about race and class, maybe a little bit from the context of Black Lives Matter, if you can, and the 1619 project, and then about what you think about the path forward with the existential threat posed by the climate crisis. And if we could make sure that you take maybe 5 minutes each, just because I want to make sure you both have an opportunity. Again, we really appreciate the fact that you have been so free to share your agreement and disagreement. So if you could now,
politics.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I feel pretty confident that we're on the same page about the 1619 project. But let me say this about the race and class question. I think the way that it makes sense to think about race, right, is that capitalist societies, but really any class society, right, can't be sustained just on the basis of coercion, right? And ideological hegemony, right, it is essential, right? I mean, to maintaining a stable social hierarchy, right? Throughout capitalist societies, but also before capitalism or outside of capitalism. One of the narratives, right, or the discourses or the ideologies that does the work of stabilizing what are social inequalities or like inequalities that are rooted in dynamic social structures is by reading them into nature, right? So that peasants had in feudal society had a natural station and a natural place in the world, and like I've written about this as a genus of ideologies of ascriptive difference that contend that sort people into taxonomic populations, so they're abstractions, right, and idealized by definition. It's sort people into these taxonomies of hierarchical difference based on what they supposedly are instead of what they do. Race is one of those. Race is a species of that genus of ideologies of ascriptive difference and hierarchy. Gender is another. feeble-mindedness in eugenics era was another. So I think it's helpful, like if we think of race as being, in effect, a technology force that helps to assign people in a stable way, like the labor markets, or into hierarchies of desert, right? If you look at the origins of industrial psychology and industrial the relations at the turn of the 20th century, there's this great a racial adaptability chart that I used to use in my teaching that lists on one axis a number of job performances and working conditions, and on the other axis something like 45 or 60 different racial groups, and it's color coded to say who's good at what. Well, guess what? That becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Like you don't hire Jews to work with pick and shovel, and it makes sense because you don't see Jews who work with pick and shovel, right? And the stereotype of Italians being good stonemasons. Well, you don't hire anybody else, so that's who the stonemasons are. What's the same thing about other race groups? So from that perspective, I've long felt that the race-class dichotomy just misses the point. But more recently, right, there's been a disturbing the resurgence of a reified ontological notion of what race is and what white supremacy is. And it sometimes now flies under the flag of Afro-pessimism that sort of reads late 19th century racist ideology back to the emergence of settled Homo sapien society and these crazy claims that the world has always been driven by white supremacy or anti-blackness, among other things. That's like a classic left informed, right in essence kind of argument, because that was the argument of people like Madison Grant and Lathrop Stoddard and the proponents of white supremacy, right? So from that perspective, also, I guess I'll close this by saying, since 2016, right? Since or 15, but since the Sanders campaign and others, right, DSA and others have sought to address working class Black and brown people as working class people, right? What we've seen coming from PMC or from professional managerial strata ideologues has been a subtle contention, and sometimes not so subtle, that working class is a racial category that applies to white people somehow, but that Blacks are joined by a set of specifically racial concerns and problems that apply only to them. I was on a Justice Dems panel a few months ago, and a loudmouth guy from Brooklyn, who was one of the candidates, refused to accept that there are significant class distinctions among Black Americans because, as he put it, when all Black Americans have my experience of being fearful when we walk out the front door and a cop can kill us. Well, in the first place, that's bullshit, right? I mean, most Black people spend much more of their time being concerned with being able to pay the rent or the mortgage, buy groceries, get access to healthcare, and get or keep a job than they do being concerned about being shot by the police.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Reid. David North, could I ask you perhaps to address the same question, but from the historical angle of the 1619 Project, because I think the World Socialist website has done an extraordinary job of exposing the faults and the limitations of that particular project. And it ties very much to the question of American democracy, race, and class today. And again, may I remind you the 5 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll try to speak. Again, I would urge all the listeners to go to the World Socialist website, wsws.org, where you can read our very extensive writings on the 1619 Project. And I want to point out that Professor Reid was interviewed by the World Socialist website, as were other leading historians, and spoke very eloquently against the project initiated by the New York Times. In essence, the 1619 Project is an attempt to create an entirely racist narrative of American history, to deny the progressive character of the American Revolution, the Civil War, and to interpret all of American history in exclusively racialist terms. It is false, and all falsifications of history are reactionary, and reactionary in the most profound sense. And they serve definite class interests. The Trotskyist movement has a long history in combating historical lies. Trotsky once said that the lie is the ideological cement of class society. So what are the class interests served by a narrative which says that the American Revolution was reactionary, that implying that it would have been better if it had never taken place, that Blacks have always fought alone, and completely excludes from its narrative of American history any acknowledgement of class. It's a version of history which, one should point out, makes incomprehensible the history of the Black population itself, because the story of the American Negro, as it developed, and then the African American, as we now, or Black as it's referred to, is the story of the integration of ever greater sections of the Black community into the polyglot American working class. It's a very critical element of that story. It is because there is no question that the Black working class was among the most oppressed, brutally exploited, denied its democratic rights. But it was always understood by the most advanced elements in American society, and certainly by the socialist movement, that the struggle for African American civil rights was in essence a class struggle, that the critical democratic questions, and there were vast democratic questions involved in the struggle for civil rights, is a struggle which must be taken up and fought for by the working class as a critical component of the struggle for socialism. Because ultimately, all issues and all profound democratic issues which remain unresolved in this country, all forms of discrimination, racism, can only be addressed to the extent that the struggle against these inequities are placed within the framework of the overall struggle for socialism. The racialist narrative, which has been developed by the New York Times, which is in a sense the ideological leader of the Democratic Party, is always directed against a struggle for working class unity. And so we've exposed these lies. As we point out, it is impossible to carry forward the defense of democratic rights if you're not even prepared to defend the legacy of the past. And I think one of the greatest crimes from an ideological standpoint, and a real example of what happens when you falsify history, is that the great heritage of democratic struggle exemplified in the American Revolution and the American Civil War is being abandoned, and it is being turned over to reactionaries like Trump to lie and posture as if they represented these traditions. Well, they represent, of course, their negation. So the fight for historical truth is an inseparable fight for the struggle for the development of working class consciousness. And we're very, very pleased that we have been able to rally, whatever our other political differences may be over various questions, the best representatives of the American academic community to speak powerfully in defense of historical truth, because that's the framework for discussing all other political questions. Whatever differences one has, we have to accept, as a basis for all discussion, an examination of an objective history. We may interpret it differently, but there has to be historical truth, and that is, been egregiously violated by the New York Times, and I'm very, very proud that the World Socialist website has played such a powerful role in refuting and exposing it.
Thank you so much. I thought it was worth reminding our audience about the similarities that you both share as well in terms of the defense of historical truth, which I think is something that we value and admire very much indeed. So if you could both maybe spare a minute or two to address the question of the existential threat posed by the climate crisis. We have our audience from all around the world, I think, at this point. But we in California, in particular, have seen the effects of the wildfire most directly, and it is affecting the lives of people. And of course, the general climate crisis itself goes beyond its manifestation in just the wildfires that we are seeing burning around the west coast of the United States right now. So could you talk about in what sense the crisis of American democracy on the eve of the 2020 elections is reflective of this crisis, and what your very different ideas of the path ahead might mean for dealing with this crisis? So David North, since we have you on here, can I ask you to perhaps give me a 2-minute answer before I turn it to Professor Reid?
Okay, well, fine. Well, first of all, if anything has been made clear by the pandemic, is that such crises, great crises related to danger of pandemics or the ecology, cannot be resolved within the framework of capitalism. The subordination of all social, natural, ecological, medical problems to the interests of profit guarantees that they will never be properly addressed. The capitalist system simply cannot. Capitalism is based on satisfying the interests of private wealth accumulation. It has nothing to do with the interests of the masses. We live in mass society. Every great problem today presents itself as a mass problem. The problem of health, the problem of ecology, the problem of education. And therefore, when speaking about a massive redistribution of wealth, we're talking about the reorganization of production based on need, not on individual profit. We are talking about the expropriation of these massive fortunes by these egotistical maniacs who seem to believe that they have a right to accumulate at the expense of society these vast fortunes, which deplete from society needed resources. Investment must be made on the basis of social need. And then all the complicated problems of ecology, all the complicated problems of organizing the resources necessary can be resolved. And I think if we look at the pandemic, it is a terrific warning of the danger that we face. I mean, the pandemic is exacting a horrifying toll. We're witnessing an incredible acceleration of the danger to the environment, certainly the wildfires, the melting of the poles, the global warming. These are not fictions, these are existential threats, but they're threats which can only be resolved through the most profound revolutionary organization of society. And so therefore, and these are my words, read the World Socialist website, become active in revolutionary socialist politics, and make the important decision to divide conventional pragmatic wisdom, cast a class-conscious vote on November 3rd, or write our candidates in for Joseph Quichot for president and Arisa Santa Cruz for vice president. This is a very, very important decision to make, and it's the beginning of a break politically from pragmatic politics, the ideological stranglehold of lesser evilism.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think that
I'd like to conclude, and I'd like to thank you very much for giving us this opportunity to debate.
Thank you very much. Professor Reid, would you like to use this opportunity? I know we have gone well over the time we had given you, so would you like this opportunity to not just address the climate crisis, but perhaps also have your final summation like Mr. North? So.
Well, yeah, I'll be brief about the climate crisis because Dave and I are in complete agreement about that. And one of our problems has been, and I think definitely the twin of, or the close cousin of the lesser evilism, doing well by doing good, is another part of the problem here. But there's also another deviation to be avoided, which is an hysterical moralist eco-catastrophism, right? Because we all know people who declaim we have 5 years, 10 years to solve the climate crisis, or all hope is lost. In the first place, that misreads the way that evolutionary change occurs, even within climates, right? So it's not going to be the day after. Like there'll be a climate, it'll be different, right? But and not especially hospitable, I mean, necessarily. But the fact is that if it were true that we had to resolve the crisis within 5 or 10 years, then I'd just go get myself a really good bottle of Irish whiskey and a straw, because there's no way that we can resolve the climate crisis in 5 or 10 years for the precise reasons that Dave laid out. And just to add to the bill of particulars, you know, at this very moment, the 7th hurricane this season is coursing across South Louisiana right now. So yeah, I mean, but the climate crisis is serious. It's like an overheated expression of all the contradictions of capitalism. And again, I would affirm, or reaffirm, that we can't address the climate crisis within capitalism. So in that sense, the struggle to save the planet and the struggle to transform capitalism are the same. With respect to general summation, I mean, people are going to do next Tuesday what they're going to do. So I'm not going to speak to that, but we definitely need that. This is all brought home to us. Everything that's happened in the Democratic Party since at least 1992, about the escalation, has brought home to us the need to organize a real institutionalized left that's rooted in the working class, and that's got to be the #1 objective right from here forward. And yeah, and I want to thank you guys again very, very much for having us both. It's been a scintillating discussion.
No,
I just were the questions.
Yeah, I must say that I should let you know that there were over 58 questions that our audience members presented. Wow. And over 325 people have stayed through this meeting, even though it was scheduled to end close to 5:30. So once again, I really wanted to thank the two of you for not just taking time from your schedules to share all your experience and thoughts with us, but also, I think, frankly, kind of illustrating to our audience at large what it means to be honest in politics and what it means to be principled and to fight for cause that one believes in, which I think is extraordinarily important. So once again, I'd like to thank David North and Adolph Reed. And as I said, had we actually been in a physical space, well, maybe we would not have been able to fit these very people, but you would have had a massive round of applause at this point. You will have to settle for my individual applause. So thank you very much. We really appreciate it. Once again, I'm so glad you were able to join us today. Thanks to our wonderful audience for sticking with us for so long, to Jonathan Grobart and Emanuele Saccarelli for organizing this, and of course to the indispensable Brianna Wiley, without whom we would not have been able to have this meeting at all. So thanks to the Political Science Department once again for sponsoring, and thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good night, you all.
Thank you, Adolf, for this very, very nice discussion. Good discussion.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thanks a lot, man. It was great. Take care.
Yeah, thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.